All right, well, it's hard for me to express to you just how much entertainment I had looking at all the great drawings that you guys made for this really wacky in-class project I had you guys do. And I even shared them with Dr. Triplett and Tracy Haynes and Michael Lander, and they all enjoyed them as well. And so I thought I'd pull aside a few of them that I thought were the most entertaining, or at least were kind of most on point, I guess is kind of what I'm getting at here. And just share those with you in case that you weren't really sure exactly what you're supposed to be drawing, or you're not sure about what you kind of drew. And I am giving these back to you and have written comments on them, but I would encourage you to kind of look through this as well. So question number one was one that kind of asked you just to write your textbook definitions for strength, hypertrophy, muscular endurance, and power. And I didn't require you to make a drawing, but I did include an example. I did have some drawings. And I guess the key thing with these terms is when it comes to strength, probably your best example is a power lifter. So that would be someone that competes in the competition that includes the bench press, the deadlift, and the back squat, because all you have to do is produce as much force as possible, and there's not a consideration for how fast you're moving anything. So it's just how much force can you produce, and that's kind of the key term with strength, is maximal force. In regards to hypertrophy, you're looking at just an increase in muscle size, and many people had the example of being a bodybuilder. But bear in mind that a lot of people might have the goal of hypertrophy that aren't necessarily a bodybuilder. So anyone that's interested in kind of increasing muscle tone or muscle definition, that kind of a thing, that is also going to be a goal for hypertrophy, is an increase in muscle size, but just probably to a lesser extent than we would imagine a bodybuilder would have. Muscular endurance is sort of a weird one because it's sort of like hypertrophy in terms of the idea that you're going to have a pretty high volume with a relatively low intensity. But the key term here with muscular endurance is the idea of submaximal force. And so you're looking at what your maximal or your submaximal work capacity is. And so it's your ability to continue doing repetition after repetition, set after set, at a relatively low overall intensity. And so it's just a matter of being able to kind of withstand a great deal of volume in a workout. And then muscular power is really looking at the ability to create force as quickly as possible. And that's kind of the key thing here, is that you're trying to produce force very, very quickly. And so the example here that many people gave was an Olympic weightlifter. So a person that competes in the competition that includes the clean and jerk and the snatch. That'd be a person that needs to be very powerful. But many athletes, many speed power athletes, football players, track and field sprinters, that kind of thing, are also going to look at power as being very important to them. So some good examples here of the definitions, and I also like the drawings that included in the bottom example too. Question number two was looking at making a pyramid that looked at the bottom of the pyramid would be the lifting goal that would have the most choices available as far as the number of lifts that a person could do in a weight room. And the top of the pyramid would be the least number of exercises that would kind of fit into that category. And most people had pyramids that looked like this, that had power or strength at the top, and then had either hypertrophy or muscular endurance at the bottom. And I'm kind of fine with either one, depending upon how you justified your answers. But I really like the idea of having power on top, because you really are looking for multi-joint movements, but multi-joint movements that you can do very quickly is what power needs to be. But I could see where a person might have strength on top, because power could also include things like plyometrics or jumping activities, could include medicine ball throws, things like that. So things that would not be included as strength opportunities. And so you might have had those two flip-flopped in either way. Same thing is true for the bottom with hypertrophy and muscular endurance. I think that the examples here have provided kind of good examples. The top one just is looking at saying the hypertrophy is the bottom because pretty much any exercise, open versus closed kinetic chain lifts, can work. Whereas the bottom example had muscular endurance in the bottom just because looking at the idea that you could do body weight exercises, whereas hypertrophy, typically you're going to have some kind of a resistance. So you have to use dumbbells or some kind of weight resistance to do that. And so that was, in their mind, why they had hypertrophy being a little bit more selective in terms of the options than endurance. But I think the general idea here is that endurance and hypertrophy, you can do lots and lots of different exercises, primarily because you can use either single joint or multi-joint movements for muscular endurance and hypertrophy, whereas for strength and for power, you're primarily restricted to multi-joint movements that you're going to use to accomplish those two goals. Question number 3 had a lot of really, really fun drawings to look at, and I included this top one, this really crazy kind of scribbling drawing, because I think it, to me at least, it really conveys the idea that for power and strength, you're starting with kind of those harder movements first. I mean, I think that really broad pencil stroke there at the top indicates that you're going to have really, really kind of harder kind of movements first, and then you're going to work your way down to easier things towards the bottom. With hypertrophy, because the wavy lines go in and out, I think it conveys the idea that you might do harder things and then easier things and back to harder things and easier things, and you're really going to mix up kind of the sequence of activities oftentimes with hypertrophy. And then with endurance, that kind of straight scribble line going down I think is nice, because it is the idea that you're just going to kind of pick a basic kind of movement or a couple kind of movements, and you're just going to kind of attack them in the same manner each way. And so I really like the drawings that were done for those. And then the bottom, I had to include these really good stick drawings down here, because strengthening power can be expressed with these multi-joint kind of movements primarily. And then hypertrophy and endurance, you have a lot of single joint kinds of movements, and with with endurance even, we're including these kind of sled pull or prowler pushes, which are kind of nice to look at too. And so really kind of showing the variety of movements that can be used, and also the order in terms of how they're chosen with that as well. On the back page then, question number 4, I included 2 different examples, because this is a really, really open-ended question. I thought it was really neat to see how people drew their triangles and squares. And so the top example is looking at the idea that for strength and for hypertrophy, for strength and for power, if you look at the ones on the very ends here, you're looking at pretty big triangles, because you're going to have perhaps a large number of sets, but pretty small squares, meaning that the number of repetitions you're going to do per set will be quite small. And that's generally true for strength and for power, is that you can't do a lot of reps because you're trying to really work out at a very, very high intensity, and your body just can't maintain that intensity for very many repetitions or very much time. And so the number of repetitions per set tends to be quite small, but you might have a relatively high number of sets. And then for hypertrophy and endurance, which are in the middle there, there you're looking at having a larger number of repetitions per set, and especially in endurance, a really big block. And then it gets across the idea that you're doing 10, 20 repetitions per set, but you may not do quite as many different sets, although hypertrophy certainly in comparison to endurance, probably more sets, just because you have to get a lot of volume in, and you're going to do lots of different exercises for that. So I really like that way that those were drawn for the top example. And then in the bottom example, different kinds of usage of triangles and squares, but I think the same idea is being conveyed here, is that strength with only one square is the idea that you're going to do a very, very low number of repetitions, and same thing with muscular power, the bottom one there. And then muscular endurance and hypertrophy, larger number of repetitions, and then the sets can vary between those two things. So really, really nice examples with those. Question number 5, this is the graph that's looking at where would you place endurance, muscular endurance, where would you place hypertrophy and strength on this graph. And I chose these two, and really for the most part, everyone was kind of in line with the idea that your highest volume and lowest intensity exercises would be muscular endurance. The kind of middle area would be hypertrophy, and then your highest intensity, lowest volume would be strength kinds of things. So I think everyone was, for the most part, in agreement with that kind of an idea. But I chose these two because they kind of address the second part of this question, which is asking about why would muscular power not be on this graph. And both these answers really kind of get at the idea of this, is that for power, you don't generally express power as a percentage of 1RM, simply because if your 1RM is very high, if you're using a high percentage of your 1 repetition maximum, if you're right at your max, you simply cannot move the weight very quickly. And because power is a mixture of your force you're creating and the velocity at which you create that force, if that force is so high that it restricts the volume that you can, or it restricts the velocity that you can create, your power output is very, very low. And so for that matter, you're not usually expressing your intensity for power movements as a percentage of 1RM, but instead you're looking at it in terms of velocity or the way that you move the weight that you're trying to hoist around. And so that's why it's not really on this graph, is that when it comes to percentage of 1RM, you're not going to express the intensity of a power movement in that way. This is our last one, some really, really fun drawings with these. And I think that the common theme that I saw with many answers was the idea that apparently everyone thinks that hypertrophy workouts, people just spend their time flexing in front of mirrors. And maybe is true, because that's a big part of, I think, the reason why people get into doing hypertrophy workouts. They're looking for aesthetics more than anything else. And then really the idea with this is that with hypertrophy workouts, that rest period is relatively short, but not quite as short as an endurance workout. And if we look at both of the examples here of endurance, we've got a person that has a puddle of sweat coming out of their head. Both of them do. In fact, maybe people had people puking and like buckets and things. It was very disgusting. But I think the idea is that an endurance workout, because the rest periods are quite short, it's very, very hard to do that. It's very, very challenging to do those kinds of workouts because you're always moving. Whereas when we shift over to power and strength, there's a lot of just sitting around and doing nothing. A lot of people have pictures of people just sitting. Even though you may have really worked hard, you're spending a lot of time in very much a passive recovery state. Whereas for endurance and hypertrophy, and many times you're doing supersets or you're doing circuits. And so there's many times kind of a dynamic recovery going on with those two kinds of workouts. Whereas for power and for strength, you're typically really just trying to recover as fully as possible before you do the next set. I like how the power person is complaining about their technique, because that is the case with most weightlifters. Just always, in fact, if I were to make my drawing of power, it'd be, instead of saying my technique sucks, it would be a person asking someone else how my technique looked, because that's usually the other question you get with weightlifters is that kind of an idea. So I hope that you kind of got an idea of what other students created with these, and I would encourage you guys to share what you came up with on your own worksheets. But I just pulled out some that I thought were really, really entertaining and really kind of got at kind of the crux of the issues with these.